Hello, my name is Tomas Wilkinson, and I was the director leading this team on the report into generating electricity from renewable energy, and I'm going to talk you through some of the main findings and recommendations from the report. Northern Ireland has been incentivising renewable electricity through the Northern Ireland Renewable Obligation or NIAO scheme from 2005 until the scheme closed to new applicants in 2017. However, successful applicants will continue to benefit from the scheme for 20 years, so the scheme will not completely stop its payments until 2037. So the way that the NIAO scheme works is that it incentivises the production of electricity from renewable sources, such as from wind, sun and from the biogas generated by anaerobic digesters. The electricity produced can either be used by the owners of the system or be sold to the grid. In addition to this, a fixed number of Renewable Obligation certificates or ROCs are earned for each megawatt hour of renewable electricity generated. These ROCs are then sold to electricity suppliers across the UK who use them as evidence to prove that a certain proportion of the electricity they supply is from a renewable source. This is known as the Renewable Obligation and is the amount of electricity that they are required to source from renewable generators, and is determined by government each year. The scheme in Northern Ireland is overseen by the Department for the Economy and the Utility Regulator and is administered by Ofgem. It doesn't directly involve any money generated from taxes, but as the ROCs are purchased by electricity suppliers, the ultimate cost of the scheme is passed on to all electricity consumers through their electricity bills. So why did we decide to do a study into the NIAO scheme? Well, partly because our office have been provided with various concerns from the media, politicians and members of the public, which I'll address later in this video. Also because, given our office's past experience in examining the Renewable Heat Incentive Scheme and the amount of money involved in the NIAO scheme, we concluded it warranted further investigation. From the scheme's beginnings in 2005 to when it finally ends in 2037, we have forecasted that the total maximum cost to all UK suppliers of purchasing the ROCs generated in Northern Ireland will be around £5 billion. In our opinion, this £5 billion is also the same amount of money that will be received by generators of renewable electricity in Northern Ireland over the same period. Electricity suppliers meet the cost of the UK-wide renewable obligation schemes by purchasing enough ROCs to prove that they have met the renewables obligation, or else they pay a buyout fee that is set by government. In Northern Ireland, at the outset, a significantly lower annual renewables obligation was agreed for Northern Ireland suppliers, taking into account the higher levels of consumer vulnerability and fuel poverty here. And because of this lower obligation level, out of the £5 billion estimate I referred to earlier, we estimate that only £1.25 billion will come from Northern Ireland suppliers to meet their renewable obligation, and therefore ultimately from Northern Ireland customers. In 2020 to 21, the obligation to purchase ROCs in Great Britain is more than 2.5 times that in Northern Ireland, and this has meant that the average cost to Northern Ireland domestic consumers of renewable electricity support schemes is considerably lower. And just to give an example, in 2018 the average cost to Northern Ireland consumers was just under £28, while in comparison consumers in Great Britain paid over £80 to support renewable electricity schemes. So more than 85% of renewable electricity generated in Northern Ireland in the year to 31st of March 2020 came from onshore wind turbines, and about 94% of these generating stations are smaller single standalone wind turbines. We found that the amount of support to these small wind turbines was considerably greater than the package of support available to similar turbines in GB, particularly after 2014. And we consider this is likely to be one of the reasons that has led to the large number of single turbines in Northern Ireland relative to GB, which we found to be around 3 times as many per square kilometre. We also identified a risk that the estimated rate of return for these standalone wind turbines is likely to be in excess of 20%, with a payback period on the original investment of around 4 years. Therefore, we concluded that the financial support from the scheme for smaller standalone turbines is likely to be excessive. Anaerobic digester plants are plants that use technology to break down various organic matter to produce biogas. This gas is then combusted to run a generator which is used to produce renewable electricity. It is this generator that is the generating station for the purposes of the NIAO scheme and not the anaerobic digester, although more often than not they do form part of the one plant. Anaerobic digesters can supply one or more accredited generating stations with the biogas that they produce. And similar to wind turbines, we find that the vast majority of AD-based generating stations in Northern Ireland were small scale, and as such received greater financial support than under the equivalent schemes in Great Britain, particularly after 2011, when financial support there began to significantly reduce, but remained the same in Northern Ireland. We also find that the modelling used by the former Department for Enterprise, Trade and Investment assumed that AD stations would be based on a wide range of generating outputs. However, in reality, most investors plan to maximise their returns by commissioning the AD-based generating stations with a capacity that enabled them to receive the maximum level of ROCs. And as a result, it's our opinion that the financial returns on many of these AD investments will be significantly greater than had been originally anticipated by government. I mentioned at the start of this video that our office had learned of various concerns raised regarding the NIAO scheme, so I'll now briefly discuss our findings in relation to those issues. One of the concerns raised was in relation to off-grid stations. In this case, the NIAO legislation allows for accredited generating stations which are not connected to the grid to use the electricity for their own purposes and also claim ROCs on the amount generated. We received an allegation in 2017 that there could be around 300 such stations who were going to join the scheme just for the purpose of claiming ROCs and with no intention of using the electricity generated for a useful purpose. When we examined the NIAO rules, we found that they were vague and non-specific as to what a permitted use for electricity could be in an off-grid station. The Department for the Economy told us that as at August 2019 there were only 54 off-grid generating stations, and that it, together with Ofgem, had carried out a detailed programme of audits and concluded that there was no wastefulness as had been suggested. Nevertheless, we have recommended that any future renewables legislation should be more specific and include a requirement to demonstrate that if electricity usage was not being met by renewables, then it would otherwise be met by electricity from fossil fuel sources. The NIAO rules also do not have any requirement for generating stations to comply with planning or environmental legislation. And we identified a significant number of wind turbines and AD-based generating stations that either did not have planning permission at all or had not complied with significant planning restrictions. We also find that out of 68 AD plants that process significant amounts of waste, 30 of them did not have the appropriate licences to do so. In all of these cases, ROCs continued to be granted simply because there was nothing in the legislation which would allow it to be stopped or require it to be stopped. We consider that if departments had worked in a joined-up way at the start of the scheme, they could have identified and addressed the inherent weaknesses in the NIAO rules and helped prevent the issues with planning permission and the environment. Another issue that came up before we started our work was the possibility of phantom AD plants. In other words, where ROCs were being paid to AD-based generating stations which did not in fact exist. A detailed investigation by Ofgem was carried out, and this found that all AD-based generating stations in receipt of ROCs did actually exist. However, the idea of phantom plants may have arisen from a misinterpretation of how the NIAO operates, since it is the generating station fuelled by biogas that is supported by the NIAO scheme rather than the AD plant supplying the biogas. Therefore, a single AD plant could supply gas to more than one generating station. However, the investigation by Ofgem did lead to the identification of an issue of gaming at 2 generating stations which were being recorded as separate in order to maximise the amount of ROCs that they could claim. In this case, Ofgem has concluded that the stations should actually be accredited as one station and therefore only get the lower level of ROCs. And also during our work we came across a large number of wind and AD based generating stations which should have been paying rates but weren't. And this was because Land and Property Services had not been made aware of their existence and therefore had not assessed them for rates. Normally there is a legal requirement on public bodies to inform Land and Property Services of any information that would amend the rates valuation list. However, in this case the utility regulator has pointed out that the Energy Order places a duty of confidentiality which they considered to override this requirement. Once we alerted the Land and Property Services to this issue, they began an exercise to assess the outstanding generating stations and as a result have recovered outstanding rates, additional outstanding rates amounting to around £2 million annually. So overall, notwithstanding all of the weaknesses and the risks that we identified, our report still acknowledges that the NIAO scheme has played an important part in the success of the executive in meeting and exceeding its target of 40% electricity consumption from renewable sources by 2020. In fact, this year it has achieved 47% from renewable sources. The use of renewable sources as a means of electricity generation undoubtedly produced significant benefits for the environment and society as a whole. However, our report sets out findings and recommendations which can help ensure future schemes are more robust and efficient.